Well, hello there. On behalf of the global team at New Pedagogies for Deep Learning, I want to welcome you all to our third webinar in a series that we are hosting during these uncertain and constrained times. My name is Mag Gardner. I'm a member of the global team, and I'm based here in Hamilton, Ontario. For those of you unaware of our work, New Pedagogies for Deep Learning is a global organization whose purpose is to foster deep learning so that all learners can contribute to the common good, address global challenges, and flourish in a complex world. Essentially, we want to enable all students to be good at learning and good at life. In future webinars, we will be sharing more about deep learning. At the end of this session, we will also share our website address so you can get more information and tap some of the great resources that will support your deep learning journey. We invite you to introduce yourself as you've been doing and indicate where you're from. We expect about 1,000 people to join us today from all corners of the earth. And as Michael presents, you may wish to ask him questions. There will be 2 opportunities to pursue some of them. It's a real pleasure now to introduce Michael Fullan. He's a professor emeritus from the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. He has a long and distinguished career as a researcher, developer, senior administrator, and policy advisor to premiers and other senior politicians from all over the world. Michael has written several award-winning books that have been translated into many languages. But let's face it, many of you have already heard his incredible bio before. So what people really want to know, Michael, is what has been your guilty pleasure during COVID-19?
That is a tough one because I don't feel guilty very often. But when I think of one thing that connects in an odd way, I have 5 children, and after about 2 weeks of isolation, we're living in different places, some of us, we started to notice that we liked the isolation individually. And that it really occurred to me that just because I've been kind of an introvert as I've grown up, that evolution has finally caught up to the Fullan gene. So that the fondness for solitude, if you like, has been one thing that clicked that I wasn't fully aware of until it hit me sharply with COVID. So that's as guilty as I can get today. So if we begin the combination of presentations, the trilogy, we're now hitting the leadership side. You've got a lot of the substance. I'm going to continue to introduce some of that substance. So I want to set it up this way. If we go to the slide, opportunity knocks. This is going to be the question of, I've put this slide presentation into 3 parts. One part is what's the problem? The other part, second part is given the problem, what do we capture as a solution? So the word capture is meant not only seize the day, but seize the decade. And then the third part is on leaders and what's the role, what have we learned about leadership and especially around nuance, which is a really great set of insights that we have now from looking at leaders handling ambiguous situations. So we'll go to the first 2 and then stop and have questions come in from you, and then we'll build on that. So let's go to the 50-year decline. It is the case, and we have analyzed what's been happening, which I call the battle of the century, which is on the one side, and if we can look at the next slide, you'll see the multifaceted climatological collapse, a bit of a mouthful, but the fact is we all know this, but it's very important to set it up this way to know where we go from here. That there has been not only the obvious things about climate, but the way in which it intersects with all kinds of other things. So the word in Anthropocene is a word that says ever since humanity is dominated, which most people say is around 1950 onwards, that we have been enough of us on the planet, enough of us not be careful what we've done. What we are doing to really have an impact that's negative and growing and difficult. So we have the climate and all its associated diseases and floods and everything we know about, very prominent. And then the second thing that actually intersects with it is what I call galloping inequality. And again, you know the numbers, but they don't really jump out at you until you see the kind of curtain drawn back by COVID, that the percentage of people who are wealthier is increasing. The 1% with so many percent of the economy, and then the bottom percent drawing out. So we have a societal context here, which is getting worse and worse, and it shows up in education with differential educational performance. So I call it a deadly convergence because galloping inequality and climatological collapse feed on each other in a downward negative spiral. So this means people are on the run. They're not really feeling that cooperative. They're anxious. All of the things that set this context. So when we think of education in our deep learning, we think of it this way. Up to this point, I'm going to say in the last 40 years, when this has really been its negative trend, schooling has been on the receiving end of a bad society. So that's really what it feels like, I think, if you're in schools. There's really so much problems, and the school is beginning to really begin to start looking at some of these problems as they go. And so if we go to looking at how they will play themselves out, we will see that education now, in our positioning of this, is say, how does education shift from being on the receiving end of things to being a proactive player in educational change and societal change? And we think that this, ironically, that COVID provides a opportunity to question that, because it allows us to reposition things, to get over the initial inequality, to do some things that are positive, but really then to focus on some of the possibilities. And so let's begin to look at that context and move to the next slide then. And this is really, the only way to put it is to say education is at a standstill. We have so many indicators now. They've been growing, but they weren't so pronounced until we brought them out in the open with all the double anxiety. So I can give you a slew of, I'll just give you a couple of examples. This slide certainly says these are the combinations, but let's put some numbers to it. We go to the next slide, we see what teachers perceive to be, this is Lee Jenkins, 2012, it's now, it's very similar, in fact, more pronounced in 2020, is that he asked teachers, large samples of teachers, what percentage of your students are engaged in learning by grade level, as teachers were. So you can see, but very high, it's kindergarten and so, and then it's down to not much more than a third by the time you're to grade 9. We can go to the Gallup poll. I'll just give you a slice on the next slide. The percentage of students who are, from now the students' point of view, not just the teachers, that are engaged in learning. And the grade 5, three quarters of the students. By the time you get to grade 12, again, about a third. We can also go to Heather Mallon. I won't show you this slide, but Heather Mallon is the head of Youth Research Center at Stanford University. And she wrote a book last year called Schooling with Purpose. And what she was delving into was what sense of purpose did students have as they went through school, as they were heading towards life. And what she found was, very similar to these figures, that by the students who are in grade 11 and 12, only about 20% of them, 1 in 5, actually, when they were asked, what's your sense of purpose, where are you going, they couldn't say much beyond, I want to get good grades, I want to go to a good university, I want to make money. They really had no sense of where they were going. So we take this as really the kind of standstill version where education is increasingly alienating for higher percentages of students. And we think also with teachers, they feel it obviously. So this is for us not only a blow, COVID itself and all the fallout, but the opportunity to do something about this really serious fundamental situation. So let's go to, if we think about COVID and the next slide, this is how I feel. I don't know how you feel, but I feel like COVID is surrounding us, it's searching us out, it's putting us on the defensive. that seems to have no endpoint. If I go back to my sociology days, the feeling of anomie or normlessness, the feeling of ennui, where everybody's worried, anxiety is going up. So that is certainly the situation we're in now. But most of us, and many of you that are listening, I know, are doing this, is saying, okay, how do we take care of the immediate and begin to take advantage of the opportunity to rebuild and change the system that should have been changed before COVID, but now we have the punctuated opportunity to do that. So that's where we stand. If I look at then the next, as we go from here, the next slide is really getting us into that, I call the dual track, because one track is the emergency, taking care of the difficult parts. The second track, almost simultaneously, is to begin to innovate. And that's, I want to get to the innovation as soon as possible. But let's look at the tracks here. We go to the next slide. The emergency response, I call it the innovation response. Track 1, lane 2. Let's continue on, emergency response. Next slide. I'm not going to dwell on this, but that we ourselves have documented. You go to our website. We're trying to provide support for those that are in what we call the unsettled or the transition stage, where it's basically emergency. How do we take care of it? It's opened up the issue of what do you do with students when they're not at school, that kind of basic, fundamental, primal thing. But it's also opened up how are kids variably doing things without schooling. And some of them are in difficulty and some of them are actually enjoying it. But to deal with the minimum support structure, the basic needs for students now is really what's preoccupied people in March and April and now into most of May. But I want to move then forward to what we might call the innovation alternative, that lane 2. And I say tinker and not because this is opportunity knocking. And so the classic question about opportunity knocking is, does anybody answer the door? And this is the answer I want to provide. I want to give you some ideas for system change that really goes from the bottom up. I do draw a lot on evolution in our research that we've been doing. And so there's a whole history of evolution, and biologists and neuroscientists, Gene Clinton has covered some of that, that basically shows that broadly speaking, evolution, which is the evolution of humans, the culture, the development, it's been in a positive direction for 10,000 years, wherever you want to go back. But there's something in the last 50 years that has us worried, that really where it seems to be stalled or going in the reverse direction. So the combination of thinking about evolution and the strategies that humanity can develop, especially the ones I'm going to outline and the leadership around it, is something that can make a big difference and actually transform the existing system. And one of the themes in evolution that I really like that E.O. Wilson, Pulitzer Prize winner, has emphasized, he said, what I like about evolution is that it's relentlessly bottom up. Think of that phrase, relentlessly bottom up. And that's what we like about it. In our work with school districts and systems in the 8 countries for a new pedagogy we're working on, we find that 80% of our best ideas are coming from the leading practitioners that are doing things with us in this case. And they've got the great ideas because they now we're able to enable them to develop these, we're able to flesh these out. So I think that we have an opportunity not to tinker, but to really go forward in a major way. So let's keep going in the slides and then we'll get to the issues. I want to start the positive flow here with Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn in 1962 wrote quite a breakthrough book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he said 2 things in that book. He said that in order for a model, or in this case, the way the system is organized, in order for it to transform, it's required to have 2 conditions. One is the negative condition that the old model doesn't work. He actually used the phrase cataclysmic difficulties. So cataclysmic difficulties is I think the system we're in, not only the world now, I'm talking about education, it's not working. And then he said, but that's not enough. It doesn't matter how bad it is, the change will not happen unless there's a valid, he said alternate, but we would probably say alternative model to take its place. So what I want to emphasize in this presentation is there's no doubt we have the first condition, the bad system. But I think we have the makings, and we think we have the makings of the alternative model and ideas to take its place. That's what the emphasis should be on the immediate future, along with the difficulty should be this innovation line to move forward on what kind of model. So where should we go and what kind of leadership will be necessary and help us? Let's go continue on this next slide. I'm going to say the next two slides are the key slides of the whole presentation. In fact, the third slide is, I would put in the same category. Because the question is, why has change failed? Why aren't students more interested? And so we'll go to the next slide. It's one of two that give you the reasons. The reason that the system has failed is it doesn't connect with what's important to students. We know in our deep learning part that these 5 things on this slide, and I won't read them out one by one, this is where students, when they think about learning and life, this is where their heads are at, their minds, their hearts. They want to connect with purpose and meaning. You heard this from Jean Clinton, of course, in the well-being. And each of these things, these 5 are missing. Old pedagogy, that is pedagogy, we're transmitting knowledge to students, testing, all of that. It doesn't work to motivate people. So what I want you to think about in the next few minutes is when you think of students that you know, your own children, students that if you're teachers or in your schools, what motivates them to want to learn? And you will know, I'm suggesting that the current system doesn't motivate them, but these are some of the factors that will. Let me reinforce this with the next slide. This next slide is from Jal Mehta and Amanda Datnow. We just did a special issue of the American Journal of Education, where they put out a call for papers that basically said the old traditional teaching, the grammar of schooling is a technical phrase, hasn't been working for almost 100 years. And they invited papers where people, researchers, could present what they considered to be alternatives that are working. They had 5 papers they accepted for publication. They asked myself and Larry Cuban, who was another longtime researcher, to comment on them. And what we saw was, and what actually the authors said, we went out and we did research on these schools that were supposed to be advanced and really getting at these parts of student learning. And what they were actually doing was they were falling back in the old ways. What was happening here? They called it the grammar of schooling that had been around for a century, whatever. So this is Jal's list. He in his book that he did with Sarah Fine, brilliant book. It's called In Search of Deep Learning. Meaningful title because they went out to schools that had deep learning. They did lots of research on them, and they found they came up almost empty, except they said around the periphery, theater clubs, after school, the odd classroom. In Search of Deep Learning, we're still searching. But in their commentary article, they said, and this is very much like the last slide that we provided from our own work, that the opportunity that schools are organized in a way that's contrary to how youth want to learn. So this is reinforcement. We know this. There's a mismatch between the goals of school. And I want to bring it home with this next slide, which is a bit controversial in one way, but I really think this is absolutely empirically true. With all the emphasis on standards, literacy, numeracy, college ready, all of those, which we ourselves, some of them at least in Ontario, we had major success in improving literacy and high school graduation, 2003 to 2013, for example. We focused on those, not so much the testing, which we have a different viewpoint than many parts of the US, but in Ontario, we focused on developing them. Huge success. Our high school graduation went from 68% to 80%. Now I'm going to say, and this is, I hope this is the main point of my message, although I'll get to leadership as well, is that you can't expect students, that 65% who are increasingly alienated, who have huge anxiety, who have all kinds of issues going on, you can't expect them to be motivated by an academic lesson, even if it's good for literacy and numeracy. I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying let's ignore literacy and numeracy. I'm saying put it in perspective. Let's go for the deep learning that you heard from well-being from Jean and the deep learning itself from Joanne. And let's make that the priority. Let it encompass literacy and numeracy. But the more you stick only with these standards as the end all and the be all, the less you will be able to reach the majority of students, which I'm going to say is at least 2/3. So that's what's missing, the essence of what learners about. So let's go continue on this same development. This means then I think that we need to go to the second part. What is the alternative? The capturing of student purpose, and that it's aligned with those two slides I showed you, the one from our work and the one from Meta and Datnow's work. It is about student purpose. It's about organizing the foundation. And actually, all you have to do is ask any group of students, how do you like to learn and what are you learning? And they'll probably say, not the way we're doing it now. And they'll come up because we students have been huge participants along with teachers in our 8-country work. And every time we see it, once students are unleashed, once they go into this new mode of learning, they light up. They go very differently, very strongly into the new purpose of learning and are very effective in doing it. So we don't have any doubt that there's the potential here. It's just that most systems are not organized to work this way. So let's go another slide. This is another powerful slide. Jean Clinton showed it. It's something that she and we developed as a result of this new work. And it's quite an interesting way of thinking about things. The double helix, many of us know vaguely, at least from DNA, the discovery of the 2 strands of the DNA structure. And if you apply it to what we're doing, and it turns out it's remarkably applicable. I'm going to say it's a metaphor. It's not an analogy. An analogy says it's the same, it works exactly like this. But I want you to think about this before we break for questions, that we have said in our foundational work now, the new work, that you have to get 2 things right, well-being and deep learning. Those very 2 things that were in the first 2 presentations. And if you can get those 2 strands, not only developing in their own right, but especially cross-connecting. And the cross-connection is relationships, and relationships of students to teachers especially, but others in doing that. And as we push this, and if you think of, if you look at the DNA and you see that the functioning of the DNA has the 2 strands, and then they have the linkages, which they call base pairs. I don't know enough about it to go as deeply as we could in the scientific sense. But if you think of base pairs, and the base pairs in the DNA are 4 elements of connection. I can start to think in this way, 4 elements of relationships that could be things like, what if the relationship connection was about belongingness? What about if that was 1 strand? What if another strand was sense of purpose and meaning? What if another strand was contributing to the world? We would have no trouble coming up with 4. And this means, and now we're getting actually a little bit closer to an analogy than a metaphor, that if the system, and we think our deep learning system actually is organized like this, well-being, good at learning, and good at life, and connections with relationships, highly specific things that are built into the pedagogy, into the model. So let's move one more. This begins to our operational solution. Joanne went over this with quite detail, so I only want to surface it here because it fits functionally what I want to say before we get to the leadership implication. So we have the 6 C's, we have the global competencies. They really fit with the slides that I showed, purpose for students. The whole thing is really falling, it's like a puzzle piece, really falling into place now. So we don't have time to go inside the 6 competencies other than to say, these are the overriding replacement for literacy, numeracy, and other things that go beneath these, but the thing comes alive. The purpose of schooling becomes alive. The role of students in their own purpose and being able to link to making a contribution. They want to do that. If you ask students, what do they want to do in learning? Many of them will say, I want to make a contribution. I don't want to be a citizen 10 years from now. I want to be a citizen today for tomorrow because the world needs us now. And I think students I would say now, the ones we know, if you take Gen Z, 1995 onward born, they have, one way of putting it is at 50% anxiety and 50% desire to make an improvement. They really are anxious. It's just that schooling doesn't allow them to fulfill that, except in cases like deep learning, where we've seen it on a very big scale. So next slide. The model, you saw it from Joanne last time. I'm not going to go into it, but you see the 6 C's in the middle. You see the strong pedagogy surrounding it with the 4 elements, including technology now in a role of being an accelerator, not a driver. You see the conditions for schooling, and at the district level, the policy level, which is less well developed. So all of that, we have fully documented. It's on the run, and we invite you to follow us, participate with us, as we show not only what have we learned in the deep learning book, our first of 2 books, the tools for going to diving into deep learning. This has really kind of got the base. It doesn't have the major foothold yet, and our purpose, and my purpose in emphasizing especially this third in the trilogy, is to say what kind of leadership is going to move us to have this a major priority, or this type of thing a major priority given the problems. Next slide. And this is the last slide before we'll break for Q&A. I just wanted to mention, we have a lot of school districts we could emphasize that are doing this. This one, I just show it because it's a pretty full development, and the information and examples and strategies are fully available because of the way they do it and document and disseminate. Ottawa Catholic School Board, one of our partnership boards, has 83 schools. It's in Ottawa, Ontario. And if you go to their website, which I have on the slide, you will see not only they were great before COVID, but in the period of COVID now, in the 3 months, they have developed these things which they have on their website. They're available, there's videos, there's development. They would not have been able to do this with such fervor and comprehensiveness had they not been a deep learning school district prior to COVID, but they have taken advantage of COVID to move it so far. So let's now switch to, I'll turn it over to Mag, and we'll get into the questions. Again, sorry for the technology blip, but let's motor on here with Mag and then with me.
Thanks, Michael. There are lots of questions, and here we're going to try to cover 5. First one, Michael, what would you say to people who recognize that there's been a 50-year decline in education in terms of engagement, and yet we've never invested so much money in education as we do now? What would you say to those people?
I would say that the money has been spent on the wrong things. That has been, and OECD, they've done the big macro analysis. They said money is important, but it's how you spend the money that's more important. So I think money hasn't been the problem, ironically. We know that in the last 20 years, the budget has gone up at least by 20% in most public cases, and yet the system has declined. This harms us because people don't want to, the public, or don't want to invest more, or the treasury people, we don't want to invest. This is a kind of a losing cause. So this is all the more reason, I think, if we change, because we now see, when you change the equation and you see the education personnel, teachers, principals, and students, you see them on the move, as we see in some of the cases. Money won't, in the short run, it's a problem because of COVID, but it has not been the problem. Just by, it hasn't been the problem. It's been badly spent. It's not the fault of individual teachers. It's the fault of the system. We've got to change the system.
Ready for question number 2?
Yep.
So you were mentioning the dual track, lane 1 and lane 2. Lane 1 was the emergency response and lane 2 was the innovation. How can you get people into lane 2 when they seem fixed in lane 1?
Well, I think if the situation is absolutely overwhelming, that is, students are not at school. They've been getting meals at school, so they don't have meals. They have terrible home lives or this situational life. If the whole thing is collapsing, as it has in some communities, then you have to pay attention to that full board attention. attention and get that sorted out. It's an emergency situation. Emergency response can take care of some of the basics right away, and that's what has to happen. But at the same time, then you have to say, well, what's the strand here out of this? If we can get meals to students so that that's not a problem, that's not going to improve learning. It'll facilitate the possibility, but it's not going to actually improve it. So I think people have to deal with the emergency, but they definitely then have to say, all right, what can we do beyond that? And of course, many systems can actually do both at once. That is, if they're not in extreme or dire circumstances, they can begin the innovation, as we see, because we're working with some of them. But I think the emergency response follow very soon with some innovative strands. And I think the innovative strands will move quickly because it's what teachers and students want. And parents, I hope, will want it.
So as we go forward, how uniform do we have to be?
Well, I don't think we have to be uniform in maybe the implication of the question. My favorite new concept of our system change, and this is our own concept, is connected autonomy. We've written about it. The latest book, The Devil in the Details, that I did with Mary Jean Gellinger, is based on that. Connected autonomy means what it says, is that I'm an autonomous person and I want to, I don't want to be crowded in. I don't want other people to tell me what to do. And so that don't fool with my autonomy. But at the same time, we say you need to be connected, because if you're autonomous and not connected, you deteriorate. We know this about solitude. We know this about social cohesion. So now we actually say, I'm going to say, you can have your cake and eat it on this one. You can be autonomous today, and you can be connected tomorrow. And the third day you can be autonomous. So in fact, one of the research findings from COVID is that students are saying, I don't want to be in front of a machine. I want to be autonomous. I don't want to be hooked to a computer to do my learning. So they're afraid of the way in which computers will restrain their options, and they want autonomy. Now, if we can get students, because I think they're predisposed to connecting with other students to do good work, if we can then have the autonomy and the connection, I know they go together, and it's a virtual pair. They feed on each other, and up it goes, and you win-win.
And you tap the brains of everyone.
Exactly.
One last question for now. I see the Q&A lighting up, so that's terrific. This one comes from New Zealand. This principal is beginning her strategic planning for the school year, and she's asking about what are the important questions that she should be asking her community about the future of education.
Well, I think you should have some ideas before you go asking to other people to fill the strategic plan. And we'll see in the final part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about nuanced leaders. And nuanced leaders, their major feature is they partner with groups and forge what I'll call in a few minutes a unity of purpose. So I think I'm going to say that leader should have some good ideas herself, and then should engage the community on that basis. They should also use students in the sense that we have found, as you know, in deep learning, that when students are excited about learning, their parents start to show up more, because the students are coming home, so I'm doing this, doing that, what do you think? And they're just blown away by what their children are capable of, that they didn't know before as much. So I think that this is a proactive thing. And I think also most people will tolerate the fact that we shouldn't have crystal clear plans. This is a time where everything's changing week after week. And if you have a crystal clear plan, you're in trouble. You're not going to adapt to change. So I think most people know that, but you have to have some lines of, this is the line to develop. This is just engaging students in learning without overwhelming them with sheer amounts. Give them some things that have to do with sense of purpose, meaning, creativity, play, all of those things that we know that work. They start to build, and you don't need a full plan, you need a momentum plan.
Great, and I think that leads us perfectly into the next section. Keep those questions coming. Thank you.
Okay, So let's head to this, what I call ubiquitous forces. It's really about leadership and change. And I'm really excited by the new work on nuance. If I take the adage I mentioned before, that 80% of our best ideas come from leading practitioners, that's how I built the book on nuance that came out last year. I identified leaders who were very successful. I knew they were. Some of them were school principals, some of them were at the district level, a couple of them were at the system level, 10 of them altogether. And I said, these people are getting big success, and what makes them tick? And so I built in the book, there's 10 case studies, and when I interviewed them, and what was interesting was they were doing a lot of the same things that other people who were leaders claimed to be doing, or you could see it on paper, but there was a world of difference in the impact. So I said, there's something going on beneath the surface here, because these plans look similar, but the one group is looking better, more effective. And what was interesting about this is when I interviewed these people for 2 or 3 hours, and at the end of the interview, they said, almost to a person, I think to a person, the 10 of them, that said, I know more about my leadership now that you've kind of pulled it out and exposed it differently. I didn't know as consciously what I was doing as you're doing. And now, in other words, they didn't know their own nuance. And so let's move ahead now to what is this famous concept, or hope to be famous concept, nuance. You'll see I have not 50 shades, but I have 5 shades. So maybe that's a secret pleasure too, but at least I have 5. And they all are about change and system change. So let's look at what this means. It's really good insights here. Nuanced leaders surface, quite a few people always want the quick fix, give me the template, the vision and all of those things, all of which are structural, superficial. The nuancers work with key principles. I'm going to give you the basic ones and the rest of these slides, and I think they'll make sense to you when you see them. Incidentally, the patron saint of nuance that I selected and featured in the book, in this part at least, is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was a master at getting at the dissected, literally, because he did dissected corpses and looking at the functioning of the body, and was able to get underneath that and then pull it together because he was interested in the bigger picture, how to make it function more effectively. So he's a model from 600 years ago. But let's see what nuance is more closely. Let's go to the next slide. I've said before a minute ago, unity of purpose. Unity of purpose is the joint determination, whether we're talking about one school district, a whole country or province or a state, that you figure out for education in this case, what are our main priorities? And obviously unity of purpose, if you focus on unity, has to be a process. My quote I usually use on this, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is the observation, the CEO of Honeywell, when he retired 10 years ago, they asked him that you've been very successful. What have you been doing what's the most important thing you've learned about leadership? And he said it this way, he said, the very most important purpose is a feature of leadership is you have to be right at the end of the meeting, not at the beginning of the meeting only. So what he was saying is if you're right at the beginning of the meeting, what you've done is you're only right in your own mind. If you're at the end of the meeting, you've processed it with the group. And so this is great. In fact, one of the old researchers, former researcher in 1920s in management, Mary Parker Fullan, she used the phrase forging unity of purpose. And I love her, but first of all, she's dead on with all the things about if you can't forge a new unity of purpose with your community, you will go nowhere. But she said it in an interesting way in the following. She said, work on it. And when you think you've achieved unity of purpose, then she paused, I would say, and said, but don't expect it to last for more than 15 seconds. And she was, I guess, saying that there's a lot of, it takes hard to get it, but it's easy to unfold. So I think unity of purpose, or what I've in the Nuance book I call joint determination, is something you can get a basic quality in your organization with. Then you have to attend to keeping it that way. People come and go, things happen in the environment like COVID, other things happen like you have good ideas, innovation. So it's a process, it's a constant thing. But if you can combine unity of purpose with what I call connected autonomy and focus it on the movement forward and look at collective impact, not with the old measures of just literacy and high school graduation. You know, don't get me off on high school graduation. It's gone up in the US for the last 20 years, 15 years, up to in the 80%. And then you look at the success rate of students graduating from high school and going to university or community colleges. And in the community colleges, it's something like only 60% of those that enter year one graduate after 4 years. And for Blacks, for example, minorities and others, it's something like 14%. It's a scandal, it's horrendous. It's because the basis isn't there. So let's go into the leadership itself, continue on to it. I'm gonna give you 8 insights about nuanced leadership. I'll do them quickly. You can read them in the book, you can dwell on them, you can send us notes. We're happy to interact. Here's the big, the first 2 actually are the foundation. Nuanced leadership is action informed by deep contextual literacy. It's a bit of an odd phrase. Contextual literacy means you understand the context of what you're in, you know, as a leader. And so this means, and let's go to the second one because I can say them together. Here's the big, I think this is the great insight that came out of this work. You have to know that new context automatically de-skills you. In other words, if you take a new job or you move in your own job in the one organization, you are automatically, at least partially, de-skilled the moment you start that new job because you don't necessarily know much of depth about the context. And the thing that distinguishes highly effective from ineffective school leaders and other leaders is they haven't taken the time, or they're not good at realizing they have to understand the context. They have to get inside what is happening. They have to understand it, influence it, hopefully. But this is what has stopped us. I can say if we look at leaders coming and going, we will find a lot of failure. And every time we find failure, I will say confidently that 90% of them was because that leader did not take the time and the commitment to understand the context and the values and the meaning that was happening in those cultures as part and parcel of trying to get change. So let's move through the other ones. Number 3, I love this. Roger Martin, former dean of management school, Rotman School at Toronto. He and Sally Osberg wrote a book, and they said, as leaders who are effective, they have the combination of being experts, that is, they have some knowledge and skills, and at the same time, they're apprentices. So that ability to not, you know, to show your good ideas, but at the same time to know what you don't know, and to be learning from students, from teachers, whatever. So constantly, I think, and obviously COVID is a prime example, you better not think you're an expert in COVID tomorrow because it's changing a mile a minute. You have to be an apprentice and a learner, but you have to have good values and good ideas. You have to take that mix into the equation and into the development that would be required along these lines. Number 4, curiosity about what is possible, obviously a very important one. In fact, an interesting finding. This won't shock you actually when you hear it, but confidence is, if anything, inversely related to effectiveness of a leader. The higher the confidence that the leader has before doing something, the less effective they would be because it ends up being overconfident. And so all of those people who do well in interviews, confident, articulate, don't trust it until you see them in action. Number 5, see below the surface. I've already highlighted Leonardo and that ability. Of course, if you immerse yourself in context, you're immersing yourself below the surface, below the line, and you're getting to know the depth of it over time. You can see examples in the book, a lot of them. Number 6, connect people to each other. This is what nuanced leaders do. They find out, and this is kind of the phrase, you'll see it later in a couple of slides, that they realize they're in the work they're doing is about their own humanity and the humanity of others. That's the core. Now, we used to say moral purpose. And yeah, moral purpose is important, but it better show itself up in the way that the organization learns and operates day after day. And we know what that looks like. You can see it in the book. Instinct for orchestration, determined for the group to be successful. Number 8, combination. I found interesting that they had interest, they didn't have things that looked like they didn't go together. So for example, humble and courageous, or we saw people that had great drive, but they had also empathy. And as these they knew they were doing something important. So I want to go and close in a couple of minutes. Next slide, to see what some of the where we're at right now, what we can do. This is, I think, the choice. The choice is to allow the status quo to prevail. And if it does, it'll become more entrenched, more ensconced than we've had before. It will be a terrible thing to have suffered through COVID without having something to show for it in the improvement of the school system in our jurisdictions. So it's more likely to happen because the status quo has first rights in some ways. It's hard to unseat. And that this goes back to Thomas Kuhn. How do you get the momentum when the new thing isn't quite strong enough yet to carry the day, even though the old thing doesn't work? It's the new thing that you have to make stronger and stronger. And I hope we in this series have given you enough ideas as to how you could join us or join yourselves with others and do some of this. So it's following through on this. Let's go to the next slide. I said the prospects for system change, I think they do in fact favor the status quo. It's going to take something to unseat what we're doing. I think the good news is that the momentum, that is the speed of change, once you get it started, once you tip it, let's use the tipping point notion, because we've seen it in our school systems, Ottawa, again, example. You tip it into this new thing, people like it, and they start to like it very quickly, and it's contagious with each other, and they move fast because it's teachers and students and leaders who are enabling that to go. So you can go very fast is the good news, but you have an initial status quo to overcome in order to get into that speed line of development. Next slide. This is my kind of almost summary slide. I found it very interesting about the notion of courage, because when I looked at the nuanced leaders, they weren't all that courageous. In fact, some of them were really scared. And that one would have thought, okay, this look at the circumstances, this better show, you better show great courage because things are at stake in this, and this is a moral purpose. But they were actually much more ambivalent about what they knew. It had to be, some changes had to be made, but they were ambivalent about whether they could actually carry the day. So if you look in the book, Mary Claire Bretherton, who's in a school in Ben Adelaide school in Lincolnshire, she faced a school that was absolutely dreadfully at the bottom of the heap when she came to be principal. She said, I was absolutely terrified about the challenge, for example, but she persisted, and she actually, within the period, less than two years, but let's say 2 years, transformed that school. Nobody left. The teachers, around 32 of them, had been there for 10 years, most of them. They had failed. Everybody was depressed. She turned it around and she said, these are not all her quotes, but these are the composite quotes from what I saw in the cases. They're always learning with and through others. They came to realize this is kind of a moral purpose breakthrough. What I'm doing is about humanity. It's about changing lives. And when they see it happening, it feeds back. It's not theory anymore. This is what I feel, I'm seeing, I'm creating, I'm seeing it happen, and I want to do more. They feel courageous after the victory more than before. Heart and mind merge, and really kind of a combination of things. So I think where we're at is taking the well-being, taking the deep learning, taking the things I said about the challenge and the 50 years of getting worse and worse, and now turning the corner. And turning the corner will have those ideas of deep learning. They will have the double helix as the core of the solution, and they will have courageous leaders, including students and teachers, that will be developing those. So next slide. This is, again, just a nuance about nuance. I mentioned unity of purpose. It's not so much that these leaders consult stakeholders. It's not like they go around and say, let's do a survey. What do you think? What do you think? They just seem to profoundly absorb what the culture, the downside and the upside, and they get inside and they change the culture with the culture. This is really, they learn experientially. They adapt as they go. They continue to refine. This is the core. This is a big calling, if you like. But if you can just think yourself, who are the top leaders that you know of in schooling, including student leaders, teacher leaders, others, you will find people who are like this. They have that kind of immersion in the culture of humanity and changing it for the better. Okay, next slide then. We'll stop with this and then we'll go to questions to finish off here. This is something from deep learning. I don't want to go so much into it, but we really do have to think about the system. We have to think about the local, which is the individual school community. We have to think about the middle, the district, the municipality. We have to think about policy. And I'll just leave it hanging other than to say what we now see in our deep learning work is each of these three parts have potential for changing. And then we connect internal to the part and the potential gets enhanced. We connect across the levels and we see it. We've definitely seen it between schools and districts. And so that's a unit that's developed. We now have to look for, is it possible to see whole states and provinces? That's the next frontier. And I think some national systems are interested because they too know that the current system isn't working. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. We have time for one Whopper question. So here's the question. What will it take for us to collaborate and as a whole planet move forward towards this tipping point of improving the system?
Well, I think that is a big question, and I think it will take a lot of focused examples at the school district level, and whatever your municipality, if you're in Finland, or the networks of schools if you're in New Zealand. It'll take out remember I said about the evolution is relentlessly bottom up. So I think the energy is the bottom up. That's one condition. The second condition where those at other levels will start to, either because the bottom is pushing or because they want to link it and pull it forward, those connections. So I think it actually happens at at each of the three levels. We actually know that there's some nations that don't like their systems. They want to improve them. There's some districts that certainly don't. So I think it's there and it's buried a bit. And what we do is get your own house in order, but as soon as possible, start connecting laterally and hierarchically.
I feel like we could have had another half hour of excellent questions. So thank you to everyone for sending them on. As we close, I just want to remind people that this PowerPoint and indeed resources and tools can be found at the NPDL website. There's information there for you to share. As well, if you have questions about deep learning, you can see our email is there. And lastly, I want to just make you aware of another webinar that we will be holding on June 18th. We invite you to join the global community for another interactive session with the global team. And we're going to be exploring how to implement deep learning as we transition back to our school buildings. This webinar will interest students for sure, teachers, and schools and districts who are trying to reopen safely while also providing rich learning opportunities that are both online and face-to-face. So registration is coming soon, and please share this information with others. I want to thank you, Michael, for your time today, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We wish you continued good health, and thank you for joining us. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.